I try to live by the Edith Piaf, I regret nothing. But, you know, I wish I'd had a little more sophistication. And also, I think when you're young, when I was young in that era of New York City, I was living a very live fast, die young kind of life where I just never thought, I mean, the idea of hitting 20 and being in my 20s seemed abstract. The idea of living to 30 seemed possibly unlikely just because I was just that kind of a nihilistic teenager. Of course, over time, in fact, pretty quickly, I tried to buckle down because one of the things that happened to me was that I was fortunate enough to pursue graphics. However, it was weird because I was pursuing graphics as ZEPHYR, the graffiti artist from the Fun Gallery. Coming up in this world, the idea that people were going to pay me for my art was unfathomable. It was like magic. And so whether it was $10 or $10,000, I was like, they're paying me for my art. I mean, maybe that's egotistical, but somehow it also comes from, being a teenage runaway and living on the streets. But I was just like, yeah, let's do this, and the legacy of like being the guy who made nice with like New York corporate suits on Madison Avenue is not like a legacy I'm like particularly like, oh, I'm that guy, like I'm not having a love affair with that per se, but it is what it is.
What do you think that graffiti did for your mind and your personality, starting it when you did, with that being like your youth and the places that you're at that time is not really what most youths are doing. How do you think that influenced your mind and made you the person that you are?
Well, graffiti is my life. They're not, I won't lie. Graffiti writing and my life, even as a 63-year-old, are inter intertwined. They're one. My love for my family is what I like to think defines me and my legacy and, you know, trying to provide and protect my family comes first. But and my loved ones, by extension, they don't have to be my immediate wife and daughters, sisters. But I don't want to give the impression that because I came to graffiti with other intentions, specifically, I'm going to be this professional artist that's, you know, I'll be using my real name. It's not a ZEPHYR thing per se. Sometimes it was on my graphics, signed at ZEPHYR, sometimes not, sometimes Witten. And then graffiti being the thing that was going to be what the interest was, so that if I wanted to play a public art game, I was going to have to fully embrace the ZEPHYR graffiti writer identity. But to tell you the truth, that was the most uncomfortable. If I started writing the name in 77 and now we're in 2024, my math is awkward, but 23 plus 24, 47 years. So if you're going to look at the 47 years of me with my name ZEPHYR and what I've done, that was actually the most awkward piece of that entire timeline was the Fun Gallery days. 51X was a little mellower showcase. Um, it didn't quite have the same hype. So it was a little more like in-house mellow. But and then later, we started all showing with this guy Yaki Kornblit in Amsterdam, which was basically just like you could have called it Fun Gallery, Holland, Netherlands, whatever, because he didn't really reinvent the wheel. He just kind of transported us across the Atlantic. But that was never comfortable for me. And that's why if a lot of people talk about like the bottom falling out of like the graffiti art market, and all this shit, and like Futura is working in the post office or something. It's like, sure, when you have like that big a buzz and hype, and then a lot of Johnny come latelys like Sydney Janis Gallery, like that aren't pure. I mean, and kind of muddy, some of it a little. Sorry, you know, it's not necessarily, shouldn't be too shocking that like the buzz will, at least for then, you got to wait these things out. If you keep your fry boots long enough, they'll probably come back into fashion. So, as far as what did I say, 47 years, I'm, I'm like fully, it's a seamless thing. Andy, me, and like my graffiti affliction and affection. I mean, you know, shit, I'm still I'm still paying freights on a very regular basis. I'll do a wall, legal or otherwise, if the shoe fits. I mean, you know, as Roger pointed out in the freight book, like once I started painting freights, Smith and Pink got me into it in 92. Hated it at first, but once I caught the freight painting bug, I mean, I've done so much more on freights than I have on subways, like no comparison. I painted a lot of subways. I tagged a lot of subway cars, but like, oh my God, I've done thousands of pieces on freights. Of course, the freights are so vast, the rolling stock, that you could do 1,000 pieces and it's like a drop in the it's not even a drop in a bucket, it's a drop in the ocean. So I'm not Ichabod. I mean, I lay no claim to like fantastic numbers, but as far as like content what's the word, continuity, or I mean, for that I can take credit, right? I never stopped since 92. Bless their hearts, Pink and Smith. They had a lot of patience with me because I hated it at first,
Why do you hate it?
because I was jaded from subways. Subways, I painted IRT cars almost exclusively, and yeah, they have three doors, but and the runner at the bottom, some bolts, but they're basically very smooth. I mean, if you look at my pieces, there generally were window downs between the doors. I even tried to keep it off the windows because back then, believe it or not, it was so the maintenance of the subways was so like primitive that when the train would get to the last stop, you would literally see not necessarily workers, but sometimes the conductor himself with a razor blade cleaning the paint from the weekend off the windows, right? Of course, his window, thank you. If it's the conductor's window and someone did a whole car, he's gonna but it was that not only primitive, but like I don't want to say understaffed. That's a whole nother conversation for another day. But like the whole, you read all in the Beyond the Streets ZEPHYR scrapbook. I mean, there's so many articles about, and they're spending $9 million on graffiti removal. Bullshit. Sorry. Absolutely untrue. I was in the trenches and they weren't spending a penny on graffiti. Yes, they built a car wash, very unsuccessful venture, but no, the conductors would clean it. So I kept it off the windows because I was like, once you put it on the glass, um, eh, you might not, it might not be there. So if you run your piece too high, you're sort of taking a chance maybe that that part won't be there a week later. So if I kept it on the metal, I was pretty confident that that's a good thing. And I'd go into the doors a little, but why would you, if you could avoid that indentation part because the doors were recessed a little, not much, but the thickness of the train, um, so like about this thick. So yeah, I tried to keep it just on those. Well, generally it was a blue line going through the silver cars. Most of the stuff I painted was on the blue IRTs with the silver IRTs with the blue stripe horizontal that would go vertical on the ends. So when I went to the freights, I think the first one I did was a box car and it had like every shitty, it had the back there, they had like a lot of times the wood thing they'd staple and the ladders and to say nothing of the doors in the middle. But it was just like, so I was like, how do you paint this? And then it was weirder still because Smith was really into using latex and brushes. So he hands me like a bucket of paint. And I'm like, what am I supposed to do? Like, what the hell? So it was just totally weird. But so I just did this like kind of straight letter thing. And it was like, it looked like a 6-year-old did it. But I was like, "Oh, okay." And then they called me and they were like, hey, we're going again. You want to go? And I was like, not really. I mean, that was horrible. That sucked. But then like this competitive, not competitive, like self-competitive like thing took hold of me because when I was in the Sunnyside yard with them, I'd see like, you know, the other dudes from New York that were like doing stuff. So like Calves and Sign Five. And then I met Muse and yeah, Muse and Free Five. But like especially Sign Five, I was like, damn, that dude, like he's doing like based to me perfect pieces, like a perfect subway piece on a freight train. So I was like, it can be done, but I got to figure out how to do it. And it took me years, but I just, in an effort to try to like pull off, I only want to pull off. And I even remember telling Pink, she's like, hey, Zeph, so do you like doing freights? And I go, no, I don't. I think you guys are crazy, but I just want to do one good piece and then I'll stop. But, I don't know if I ever did a good piece, but like I never stopped. So 92, what's that, 32 years. So been painting them for 32 years, right?
What do you think about the fact that graffiti's become more mainstream? There's way more people doing it now, probably more than ever, globally speaking. And when you started, it was probably just like compared to now, relatively a handful of people.
Yeah, it was confined at first to Philly and New York, and then it made its way to the West Coast, California. And then apparently when we went with Yaki and showed in the Netherlands is when that, Holland did Holland, Shoe and Delta and et cetera. But do you mean culturally by like the fans and the world at large, or do you mean like the ones actually going out risking life and limb to do it and jail time?
Yeah, I would say probably both.
Um,
Just in general, like as a phenomena, as something that is a huge part of your life, something that is your life. and it changing this much. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, I don't really have a I don't really have an answer. I it's there's only there's very rare you and I both you and I and anyone listening, we all know that there's very few pockets on the globe geographically that are not touched and impacted by graffiti. In places where it's I was in Spain last summer. In places where it's just massive. I mean, where the volume of names is just absolutely mind-boggling. Definitely like parts of, I mean, I don't want to single out Spain, but parts of Spain where I drove, and I'm just driving on basically highways for miles, and it's just a gallery of like it appears when you're driving down those roads that graffiti is legal and you could just execute it in broad daylight. Neither of those things are the case, but when you're like seeing what you're seeing out the car window, it's just like insane. On the other hand, there's plenty of places, not just in the Middle East, parts of Asia, but where you're not gonna there everything is pristine and nobody's gonna do graffiti because it's not worth, being executed or jailed for life for. So, you know, there's a this and that in terms of what is out there. But as far as like the prevalence of graffiti throughout the West and a lot of the East on the globe, um, clearly, I mean, just stating the obvious, like clearly the nerve that it touched, and you're very correct in pointing out, and I appreciate that a lot, that in our day, it was a very, well, relatively small clique of sort of monks practicing in caves. And there was a lot of effort to connect with each other. But because just a litany of the nature of things that were sort of hurdles to networking, who was doing it, and like the youth aspect and the geographic divergent aspect, and then the potential communication barriers, you know, meeting other graffiti writers you know, was definitely a primitive practice. I mean, if you went to the last car of the train, like sometimes you'd meet other graffiti writers because they would want to do motion tags. A graffiti writer will always spot another graffiti writer, right? Or if you're in the certain stations, you're benching trains. But basically, we were a relatively small group and we weren't intermingled very, very well. We ended up with our little pockets of our homies and we were kind of isolated, like in general. So it did come from that. And now it's another thing. I like to think that the same thing that made us in our time as teenagers, like, when I did the Dondi book, one of the things I wanted to convey was that, first of all, I was interested in that book for regular people, so-called civilians. I wasn't trying to write a biography of Dondi for like the graffiti cognoscenti necessarily. Obviously, that's who would appreciate it most and understand the book and understand who he was. But that wasn't who I was thinking about when I wrote it. I was thinking about like, you know, someone's Uncle Milton, to use a name that's been in the papers, you know, um, who like knows nothing, but picks up the book in Barnes and Noble and is like, oh, this is kind of interesting, right? Because I wanted to present Andy as just an artist. The fact that his medium of choice was a subway car, um, I didn't want to like, I didn't want to sensationalize that. It was just like, well, some people use canvas, some people use paper. This guy used subway cars. But what was really important, I thought, when I made the book was that people understood the complexity of his approach to painting a more or less simple mechanized looking piece on a subway car. Not particularly simple, but you know, that he developed it on paper and planned it out so carefully. And like Lee and everyone else from that era, and hence has to make sure they have the right paint to do it. So the planning, it's not like, oh, we just like drink a beer and like run into the train yard and scribble our name. It's like the planning is paramount. And in those teenage days, I like to joke that we ate, slept, and breathed graffiti because you'd wake up in the morning thinking about your next piece and your next trip to the yards or whatever, even if it was days away. And the entire week, there was so much that went into the moment, you were going to enter the train yard and paint. You know, I think that that was deeply, at the risk of sounding grandiose, that was deeply, to be that motivated even at that young age, to internalize that practice in such a categoric way, um, says to me why it's this global phenomenon. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but I get it. To use skateboarding and the X Games and the global skateboarding beyond where its various transactions as to street with the ollieing and using the street and half pipes and empty pools before that, and then the X Games and the Olympics, whatever, right? And globally, kids anywhere on the planet with the same affection that the very first, Z Boys in Santa Monica, who I snatched my name from. That's why I'm wearing Alpha's shirt. um, the love and the affection and the visceral connection to graffiti and skateboarding was as real in its impetus, in its immediate birth, as it is today. The fact that it expanded geometrically over the decades, to me, is not really a head scratcher. In other words, what I'm saying is like, if my friends and I loved it and would like die, live and die for it, then I shrug my shoulders. It's like, then it's not really that brain surgery to see how it could be cultivated in the minds and hands of basically everyone, like literally the world over. And what's really funny is that as the young guys who were young get old, like myself, you end up with these old guys who are putting in just as much work as the young guys. It's not even, I mean, maybe a little less and they're more challenged physically, but like, you know, I mean, let's just say a lot of freight guys are not probably who one a civilian seeing the freights painted assumes is painting the freights, they're or as we like to joke, if the cops catch me, they're going to tell me, did you bring your Depends with you or something? So,
Yeah. Yeah. Do you remember your first experiences with the train yards in New York City?
oh, of course, like it was yesterday.
Yeah. I know that your crew's involvement with the one line and your relationship with it kind of changed um with like what happened to Ali there, and then just getting not getting over it, but dealing with that fact, and then going there anyways and actually finding comfort in that, in that yard, and just going there and being able to bring food in and knowing where the lights are and being able to switch things in and out, just really like knowing where the escape hatches are and just really becoming home there, having that really be the natural environment. What was your relationship with that line?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm glad you've read. I know what you're I know what you've been reading. So yeah, that's all accurate. And so for people that don't know that story, is that in 73, I believe, Ali, who later became a good friend, and as I talked about Stash and the protege mentor system, Ali was that for me. So even though he was a retired graffiti writer and he only made one comeback with Hayes, where he did the I Love New York car, because of his accident in 73, you know, he wasn't about to make a subway writing comeback. And specifically, he caught fire. His spontaneous combustion from a spark of a passing train ignited the fumes around him. So he burst into flames from the fumes, from the paint fumes. And he caught fire and he was badly burned and he did recover. He was scarred in parts of his body, but he fully recovered. Thank God. Later died from drug abuse, which is tragic. Um, it's so sad that he's just not here anymore because he was such an extraordinary human being. But yes, what happened was the tunnel under City College, 137 to 145th Street and Broadway, where they parked the one trains, um, was had like a haunted house you didn't want to go in, basically, was the vibe. But Bill Rock, who created the RTW crew in 77, was a very he had a lot of swagger. He was a very Bill Rock's like an amazing guy. He's like a hippie guy, but he's like a really tough hippie guy. It's like a really interesting mixture of like kind of gangster hippie. And he went in there and was just like, to hell with all this superstition and these bad vibes, blah, blah, blah. And then he came back to our hangout, which was behind the band shell in Central Park on 72nd Street, where RTW, the early RTW guys, and a lot of graffiti writers, old and new, hung out. Um, and basically told the original three, four of us that were RTW, me, uh, I mean, a lot of guys who didn't, they were just taggers and they didn't stick with it. Like SAG 3 was a guy who was like a tagger early on. He probably told me, SAG. Rasta, and Revolt. Like I went in there and it looks cool and it's just trains and like we got to go back and we got to like do pieces and blah, blah, blah. So that was how it started. And the funny thing, it was a weekend spot. Dudes who tried to go, over the years, I tried to go weeknights, never a good idea. Sometimes had some success on weeknights, but the place was more like workers and stuff on weeknights. But on weekends, forget it. They would just park it Friday night and not pull it out till Monday morning. And it was just like, you know, it was just an optimal, amazing place. And that is where we cut our teeth, so to speak, RTW. The funny thing is, we used to wake up on Saturday mornings. Sometimes we'd all like sleep in one of our friends' basements. Later, he started writing too, Vandal. But before that, he was just like a dude we hung out with. And he lived in a brownstone right by where we hung out in Central Park. And his mom was divorced, but they lived in this really nice brownstone. And so we kind of converted the basement into like like the RTW club. You know, we'd sleep in there, like in sleeping bags and stuff. And so long story long, like Saturday mornings, we'd wake up and we'd get in the one train and we'd go up, get off at 145th Street and just go into the tunnel, basically spend the whole Saturday there. The funny thing is the crews who were painting it at the time that we looked up to with awe, because we were really freaking toy back then, which was TMT and TDS, the Death Squad and the Magnificent Team. They will go at night, which is kind of funny because like you didn't have to. But that was their prerogative and they painted at night. What was really amazing looking back is that like we'd go in and we'd see their new pieces. You know, it was kind of funny dichotomy because like we go in and see their amazing pieces and then we go and paint some really shitty pieces. But you know, it was a really I always joke like it was the best art studio I ever had because um well anyway, I won't get into the details of how it was laid up, but in short, you had an uptown track that had a huge, I don't think it had a full, did it have a track or just a space? I don't even think it had a track you had to worry about tripping over. The uptown line just had this huge space, like the width of a track. So you could totally stand back. I mean, I wish I was doing better pieces back then, you know, because it was like, it was just such a perfect thing. And there were this row of like light bulbs, you know, they were just hanging from these wires and stuff. Um, so yeah, the thing you read was that if there wasn't a light bulb in the socket of this string of lights where you were and you wanted to paint, you could just take one from another and then screw it in or whatever. And then you had light where it was like amazing, right? There was ventilation because there were these grates or whatever that sometimes when you'd paint, then the train would come and you'd see like the fumes would kind of dissipate upwards to the street. And then on the other side, there was two rows on the downtown side, and that was a little trickier because there's so many poles. Um, and the gap between the two trains wasn't the most fun to paint. But to tell you the truth, like if I'd wanted to do top to bottoms or hold cars, which I didn't, I did one heist silver whole car in there. Um, Again, it was because the windows, like cleaning the windows, I was like, but you could stand between, you could pull like so you could open the doors, the side doors. A trick we learned was that if you went down to like there was a little two-seater seat at the end of the car, if you open the seat there was a lever inside it, and if you pulled the lever, all the doors would open, the side doors would open. And so if you open the side doors on one side of a train, you could kind of reach across to paint the other train, kind of. So if you wanted to do whole cars, and that's how guys did whole cars. I mean, I saw some great like Part and Knox, some of their most famous whole cars, and the Two Wild that Fuzz did with Knock. That I think it was a Two Wild Boy whole car. They had painted those when I came in. So they had painted them the night before. That was amazing to like stand in front of those. The paint is still sticky. Amazing whole cars. I think they painted them, if I remember correctly, on the exposed side to the passing trains on the downtown side. So they must have had like step ladders or something. But then you have to duck the trains. So we painted a lot on the uptown side on this, against, like, you'd have the wall on one side. So and it was great. I mean, you wouldn't have to stop when a train came through, you wouldn't have to stop painting because you're behind the parked trains. So yeah, 3 rows of trains, the entire length, 137 to 145th. And when we started, we were just taggers. We were just marker taggers. So we were going in there. I think that, yeah, they'd locked the doors, but we had the keys. And it was just like, we were going to elevated layups too, up on 225th. So as you get closer to the 1 yard, up at 247 at the last stop, there's two layups up there between the stations at night. And that's really even before I don't want to say before the one tunnel or simultaneously, but that was also where we cut our teeth. We had not, we hadn't, we really didn't know how to do pieces. Um, we hadn't gotten that level of ambition yet. So a typical night would be just going through the cars like one at a time and just like trying to put up tags. And you know, it's funny in hindsight. I mean, that felt like work. It was pretty like you'd be so spent and dirty by the end because you're going car to car. Yeah, it's pretty systematic. I mean, it'd be funny because we'd be sometimes waiting out this guy who would be sweeping, a worker would be like sweeping out the floors of the trays. And like then he'd leave and turn off the lights, and then we'd see him leave, and then we'd go and kind of do what he just did, except we're putting up tags. And I'll tell you the truth, the trains on the insides were so tagged that when we came along in 78, sometimes it was really hard to find a spot even on some of those cars to put up tags. But yeah. I mean, anyway, I'll give a shout out to a book not related to graffiti, but Bruce Davidson was a photographer back in that era who did all these great portraits of folks, just bizarre characters and interesting people in subway cars. But it really has some amazing photos of interior IRT cars of that era. I think it's just called Subway. Bruce Davidson was a very renowned photographer. And anyway, I'm going to give a shout out to that. Anyone who wants to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, dude, it's a crazy thing to think about the journey that you've been on from your start to being able to make a living off of it to being where you're at now and everything that comes in between and all the stories and all the essentially like um influential legacy that you've done. So I want to say thank you and respect for that, because you've influenced myself and my friend group and a lot of people, you and your peers. And thank
Well, I
you.
appreciate that. Thank you. It's very nice of you to say. I mean, I like to think I'm like the most regular, pretty boring guy, that just, puts his pants on one leg at a time. Uh, I'm a little eccentric. I've been racing bicycles since I was a kid. Haven't stopped that. That keeps me either young or old. And I'm vegan, so I try to stick to a plant-based diet. And I'm a family man and still try to like paint on a regular basis. But, you know, I don't try to get into the like graffiti artist thing too hard because I think the semantics of like artist is like can get almost pretentious really quickly because I think at the risk of sounding cliche, like art is in the eye of the beholder. So it's like if you like what I do and you want to call it art, then it's art. If as for me, I'm probably from that old school lexicon of like a graffiti writer, of just the name as your brand and the repetitive nature of putting it up in different places. In my case, the tag, I try to keep it the same. My pieces, I try to keep them very legible, usually bright yellow for uh, bright impact. And as I say, if you've seen one, you've seen them all. But I've been very fortunate because part of being around for so long and the networking, I guess, that I did, I've had the luxury of being able to work in so many different, wear a lot of different hats in the world of art, so to speak. So while I get a lot less calls about, will you make me art? I get a lot more calls about like consultancy work about, people are really interested in like I knew Basquiat Jean from very young, long before he was even doing Samo tags. I happened to just know him socially from when we were very young. So like people are really interested in that, or somebody was asking me to talk about my friendship with Keith Haring and people like that. You know, so being sort of a proverbial fly on the wall, in the 80s when so many interesting things that what gets lost in time is the crucible from which like you could buy all the, well, if you've got a couple 100 million, I guess you could buy an actual Basquiat, but you could buy plenty of Basquiat merchandise. But the early days of like the humble days of Jean running around drinking 40s is, I guess there have been some books written about him, but don't even know how well some of those people knew him. And so like in that sense, I do enjoy, I guess you could say like the venerability of my longevity because I always told a lot of graffiti writers like put your ideas and your history, try to write it because otherwise our histories are going to be told by other people. It's much better if you can do it yourself because they might get it wrong. With the caveat that, some of the books that my generation of graffiti writers have generated um, sometimes are a little loose with some of the actual facts, but that's memory is a soluble substance. And also at the same time, if you write a book, you're entitled to exercise artistic license at your discretion. But I'm trying to do the same thing too. I'm constantly trying to put together the notes for some kind of autobiography or coffee table book of my stuff, just so, if nothing else, so that my daughters like kind of know who their dad was, because when you're just dad, well, I don't want to say just dad, but it's like oh, you did some interesting stuff, but it was long before I was born, so it's not really on my radar. But I figure after I'm gone, it might pique their interest a little. So, but I appreciate your words, man. It's very, very kind of you.